Dole bludgers and frauds. You must have heard about them all on your TV. They're the Australians using your tax dollars directly to fund their laziness, their drugs, and their habits. The government in 2017 alone recovered $40 million that have been illegally defrauded from the Australian public. Let that sink in. $40 million recovered from all over Australia. Huh? 40 million. Doing the math, comparing that to, say, tax exemptions to churches, the amount given in franking credits and mining subsidies, it seems quite minuscule. I wonder though, have you heard of the term moral panic? Originally coined by Stanley Cohen, moral panic was a theory based on the idea that the media regularly represents issues in a black and white narrative. This narrative is formed to broadcast a clear villain, i.e. a folk devil. Cohen argues that the creation of a folk devil can provoke a moral panic. This theory is very relevant to my digital artifact in many ways. One way especially being that it helps clearly outline specific criteria associated with a moral panic. It's quite clear to the audience when watching a current affair, Sky News, or some other more right-leaning media, how the portrayal of a Dole bludger is almost always in a negative light. I think that's pretty much abundantly clear to most Australians. I did some content analysis on a current affairs YouTube page and found that whilst 93 videos were based on welfare, only one showed welfare recipients in a somewhat favourable light. This was one regarding the fact that Newstart hasn't been increased in over 20 years and that people are living on $40 a day. The video and thesis I prepared attempts to explore the idea that the perpetuation of the panic of a Dole bludger creates division in the public and takes the spotlight away from the much larger root causes and issues. This theory draws heavy parallels to Stuart Hall's Policing the Crisis, which came out in 1979, in which he examined the moral panic that developed over the crime of mugging in the 1970s. Hall argued that the moral panic over black criminality at the time created a division away from the wider economic crisis, black youths being out of control being the headline of the time, rather than capitalism in crisis. As Hall was not arguing that mugging wasn't an issue, I'm not arguing that welfare fraud isn't occurring. What I am focusing on is how the media formed a somewhat of a magnifying glass on that one issue, diverting eyes from the root cause, specific numerics around the rate of Dole bludgers, and other spending/government responsibilities that could be concerned. I will be expanding through this thesis on three key questions. What is the real cost to Australia? The creation of division and how it's used to divide us, and what this micro-focus on Dole bludgers distracts us from. What is the real cost to Australia? So what is the real cost to Australia? Is the moral panic created around Dole bludgers substantiated by facts? The short answer is no. As mentioned in the intro, we can see through statistics from the Department of Human Services that only around $40 million in Centrelink debt was able to be raised through the government's report fraud program. We can also see that out of 108,798 tip-offs of welfare fraud, only 118 of these cases were referred to the Commonwealth Director of Prosecutions. That's right, for every 108,798 people accused, 118 had to go to prosecution, showing that the suspicion of people was incredibly unnecessary. Furthermore, looking into the OECD data on social spending, we can examine how we are ranked in spending compared to the rest of the nations on this list. It breaks countries down, with the countries up top spending most on programs such as low income, support, unemployed, disabled, etc., which is commonly referred in Australia as welfare. The OECD is one of the most reliable sources for comparable statistics and economic social data. This table is particularly useful for my research text. Australia is ranked 26th in the OECD nation for welfare spending, which is very low compared to many other countries. This is quite a stark contrast from the damage the media leads you to believe Dole bludgers are creating. This source is particularly useful in helping me outline how moral panic can lead large audiences to jump to simple, uninformed conclusions. Although the statistics don't have anything to do with moral panic, they serve as a great indicator of Australia's low welfare spending comparative to other nations on the list. Understanding this is integral in self-examining and making conclusions on the disproportionate coverage of the Dole bludger villain stereotype, which is so heavily portrayed in the media. Information is also very important to outline before the next segments of this video, and it serves as a precursor and puts into perspective the information discussed. Creation of the division. This moral panic is then inserted into the public and creates a division of values between citizens. It creates division between the working class who buy into this moral panic and also the people receiving benefits and those who believe heavily in funding social welfare system. On the surface level, it often splits the two big political parties, with the Liberals being more conservative in their approach and Labor putting more of an emphasis on welfare spending. However, it is more nuanced than that. Centrelink was actually created by Stuart Robert, an Australian Liberal Party politician in 1997. A fundamental Australian belief has always been that of a fair go, which is entrenched in our collective value system. Welfare can be a fundamental safety net for those people struggling in Australia. A classic case is our opposition leader, Anthony Albanese, and a story of how his mother escaped poverty through public housing and welfare benefits. Looking back into her current affair, we saw that 92 out of 93 videos were of negative coverage, and even the one they showed was not one displaying a success story. This constant negative press means the public is uninformed of the nuanced issue that is welfare. When looking into the Centre of Independent Studies, a Fair Go fact or fiction report, we see that despite periodic claims that the Fair Go is under attack, rates of social mobility reveal that Australia is a Fair Go success story. Individuals from all backgrounds are able to move into every socio-economic stratum in large numbers. So when looking into these studies, ideas and values alongside the actual cost on the welfare of Australia show that the division created through moral panic seems more and more unfounded. I think it is a good time to play this clip, which aired on the Today Show, which included a government report for the worst suburbs for welfare fraud.
There's a new list of shame out this morning, with the federal government pinpointing the 10 worst suburbs across the country for Dole recipients who failed to turn up to appointments or job interviews.
Caboolture, north of Brisbane, has been named Australia's Dole Bludger capital. It has 387 welfare recipients who regularly fail to turn up for work for the Dole appointment.
The government strongly tried to deny that they were trying to shame these suburbs. However, by ranking them as the worst suburbs, they are tarring the area's reputations and identity. Through this creation of division, the public are given someone to blame for high tax rates, and moving on to my next point, are distracted from some other issues, which make the money lost on Dole Bludgers seem completely disproportionate. What this micro-focus distracts us from. This leads into my last point. This micro-focus distracts from much larger spending and governmental responsibility, which is not reported on. One example is unemployment. By focusing on shifting unemployment away from the government's responsibility and putting it into the hand of the workers, we create the idea that if someone is unemployed, they are simply too lazy to get a job. This notion is not true, as we see represented by the fact that unemployment has risen in an upwards trajectory since the 1970s. Furthermore, it can be said, as reported by the ABC, that in rough terms, Australia's economy has run on two different growth models in the past 75 years. For 25 years, we ran on the full employment model, and unemployment stayed around 2%. However, in the 1970s, that system broke down, and policymakers began to shift the economy into the new growth model. Under the new policy model, cemented in the 1980s, policymakers deliberately allowed much higher levels of unemployment. That higher level of unemployment was used as a policy tool to suppress wages and inflation. It's the system we're living with today. So what that means is essentially it benefits Australia economically to keep unemployment up. This economic growth can be coincided with the significant growth of wealth and income equality in Australia at the same time. Furthermore, during this time, the amount of time people stayed unemployed also increased dramatically to where it is today, creating issues that are required to be addressed by welfare. These points and policies significantly burden the government with a lot more blame for the creation of these Dole Bludgers. Furthermore, in this article provided by eTax, it examines logistically how much money multinational companies are avoiding paying to the Australian tax office. The article identifies tax avoidance practices and measures that cost Australia as much as $80 billion a year. This article is relevant to my thesis as it really puts into perspective the estimated 40 million lost in welfare as compared to the estimated 80 billion lost in corporate tax avoidance. And there's plenty more of these issues to examine. such as mining subsidies, church tax exemptions, larger companies being provided JobKeeper during COVID, yet still turning a profit and not having to pay that money back, as well as franking credits. The list is cumulative. However, the moral panic of Dole Bludgers provides a good villain to look towards instead of blaming the much larger systemic issues. This video has examined how the idea of a Dole Bludger has been perpetuated by the Australian media. It reflected on how the media has created a hysteria, mirroring the characteristics of a moral panic. This judgment was notably informed by Stanley Cohen's description of a moral panic. Furthermore, this article balanced the hysteria caused by said moral panic with the actual cost of Dole Bludgers on the Australian public, and drew the conclusion that the coverage is disproportionately negative and the way it is portrayed creates a harmful perception of welfare recipients. My theory then went on to delve into the dividing effect this panic has on the Australian public. In conclusion, this video has theorized that this micro-focus is able to distract from much larger spending and governmental responsibility, which in proportion to the panic is not painted as a concern to the Australian public.